The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
So make sure that you're all set and ready to go. We're going to have a lot of ground to cover. As far as I'm competing with people, what's happening right now? Hello. Hi, guys. It's okay, I'll wait. This is amazing. It's like watching TV. You know what I mean? Like, I can talk to the TV. I do talk to the TV. Anybody else yell at the television when they're mad at a show? That's how I feel right now. I feel like I'm yelling at the television. This is why I move around so much. Because then I do this. I fly like an airplane. And I walk back here. And hey, let's focus up front for a couple of seconds. All right. Hello. You got a new face, but you look like a new face. Did you miss a day?
I did miss one day.
Okay. For a second I thought I was losing my mind or I wasn't looking in a certain direction in this class, and now, okay. I feel better. Okay, like I was saying a second ago, what I would like you to do is make sure you've got all the material that we need for this lesson available. If you've already got your file inside of Adobe After Effects, that's awesome. We are going to be looking at examples of and talking about motion a lot tonight. So there's a lot of ground we need to cover. We're going to get into keyframing basics. We're going to look at Graph Editor. We're going to play around with some of the other basic tools and concepts inside of After Effects. And I'm going to give you time to play in the software with a lot of these different tools that we're going to be talking about as well. So the quicker that we can get into that, the quicker we can get to those play sessions and hopefully get you guys feeling more immersed and more comfortable with the tools. Okay, I'm also going to be recording all of this via good old-fashioned QuickTime on a separate computer so that you can then watch everything that we're talking about in class later on if you need to. So don't worry. And I'll probably stop saying this once you guys get used to the cadence. Don't worry too much about following along when I start breaking things down step by step. I mean, take notes, do whatever it is that works for you so that you can get comfortable and feel like you're getting everything out of the class. But if I say a key command, what was the middle thing? Don't worry about that. It'll be in the lecture video, and you'll be able to just look when it's time. Okay, so you don't have to get a hand cramp trying to take notes. I have no problem re-explaining things as well, when they come up. The only problem is during a demonstration, it's real difficult to stop for a long period of time and re-explain topics because I'll be recording this lecture for everybody. So if, and this rarely ever happens, but if for some reason I say to you, why don't we hold off on that and I'll come back to you in a bit, just understand it's not because I suddenly forgot how to human. It's because, we're making the video and I want to make sure that everybody is at a place where I can stop the video and then answer those questions. Is that fair? Does that make sense? Everybody's good with that? Yeah, cool, okay. So you guys do what I asked you to do and I will do this and then we'll meet in the middle. I don't know why this isn't logging in. Come on. Time is money. Money is power. Power is pizza. Pizza is money. Another Parks and Rec quote, sorry. April Ludgate. We all know April Ludgate, right? That's one of the best chaotic evil characters, or I guess chaotic neutral characters I've ever seen in a TV show. All right. Okay, here we go inside of Adobe Illustrator. And I'm going to record this little lecture, so we're going to fire up QuickTime. Okay, and in the last class, we went through, actually in the past couple of classes, we went through the process of kind of breaking down the logo that we created so that we can utilize it inside of After Effects. And that included making sure that we had everything broken down based on layers, and you can see that here. Now, before we go too far, I should say that there's probably more work to be done in developing this logo for animation because, again, the more we do in the software that generates the elements that we're using for animation, the easier our animation job will be. And the main element that I'm referring to right now is our scissors, right? If I wanted to animate those scissors, I would want those scissors to be broken apart so that I can access one side from the other, okay? Now there's a couple of ways that we could go about doing that. I guess I probably should do it since we're talking about it. So let's very quickly zoom in here. And let's take our scissors and actually make a duplicate version of each side so that we can better animate these later, or at least separate what's here. Okay. So to do that, if I duplicate this layer, that gives me a copy that I can go back to if I do something that I don't like, and that's always good. The copy layer, I'm going to take this and actually break this apart. And if we go into the layer, we can see that within this group that this is a compound path. I'm going to drag this out of the group because it doesn't need to be in one. And if I go into outline mode, I can see exactly what this shape is. Okay. Now we've already duplicated this, but I'm going to copy this. So Command C. And what I'm going to do now is basically delete the parts that I do not need. So we'll start by deleting this side. So I'm going to go like that. And then I'm going to grab the pen tool, okay, P key, and I'm going to click on the end point, and I'm going to get rid of my smart cursor here too, which is tough to see because the highlight color is ridiculous cyan. Let's make this light blue. There we go. See those points? I'm going to click on one of these points and then click on the other point to join this. Okay, and then I can use these handles to manipulate this if I need to make it more smooth, but that actually looks pretty good. And those are joined, you can see that there. Now I'm going to back up a little bit. I'm going to grab these points and just delete those as well. And then back to the pen tool, same drill, click on the end point, close the path by clicking on the point beneath it that closes this up, and then I'll make sure this is closed, and it is. Then if we go back into outline mode, I've got this side of the scissors. Now if I paste, okay, Command F, I paste in the copy of the scissors that I made. Okay, so I'm going to turn off the one that I just created from the copy, which is the side that starts lower left and ends top right, and I'm going to do the same thing with the opposite side. Okay, so let's click on this shape. Let's grab the lasso selector and let's go like that. Delete those points, grab the pen tool, connect, and connect. Okay, now this is going to be a little bit weird because we've got this what's supposed to be like a shadow to show the blades separated. We can make that on our own in After Effects, so I'm going to get rid of that here. And to do that, I'm going to add a point, probably right, I'm going to say there, right on that line, and then remove this point like so. Okay, and I might have to move this down a little bit to even it out. That looks pretty good. And now I can delete the rest of this blade, which is essentially just this one point. So if I select that and hit delete, now I can grab the P key, which is the pen tool, click on that bottom point and connect it to this one. There we go. And then Command Y, we still have our compound path. And now this shape is separated, and we even still have that same hole that we can use to control our anchor point. What's the anchor point, Sean? Well, you'll see. Okay, so let's take our scissors. Let's call this scissors left. Okay, and the left-hand side will be the bottom one. And then we'll make a new layer. We'll put this there. Actually, that's the bottom one, so I don't want to put that one there. Come on. I want that one there, right? Yeah, there we go. And we'll call this one scissors right. Okay, so we didn't do that in the last class. I didn't want to spend too much time doing this. It doesn't take that long, but we needed the precious moments in the last class to finish things off to a certain point. So I'm doing that here. I'm going to get rid of this original scissors layer since I don't need it. I'll go ahead and delete it. Okay. I'll turn all this back on. I'm going to save this. And I'm doing this also to show another problem. Not really a problem, but an issue inside of After Effects. And this issue is going to affect everybody probably right up front for the same reason it's going to affect my scene when I open it in a moment. Okay? We just edited our Illustrator file even though we've already created an After Effects document and brought these elements into that document. Okay? Normally, you can take an Illustrator file that's already placed in After Effects, open it inside of Illustrator, make changes, and then those changes will show up fine inside of After Effects. Okay? Now I'm going to say this again, and I want you to pay attention to the words that I'm using, and trust me when I say this. This isn't on you. This is just a point that I want to make very clear right now. We can modify elements in an Illustrator file, save it, and if it's already placed in After Effects, everything will update and everything will be flawless, okay, within reason. Now we're going to go over to After Effects, where I have the file open, and after I turn off Caps Lock, we're going to have a problem. And why do we have that problem based on what I just said? I just told you that you should be able to do what I did and everything will work out fine, and it's not fine. It's the furthest thing from fine. What's happening?
Because you removed that layer and made 2 new layers.
Exactly. After Effects will not look at your Illustrator layers. Okay? In other words, it won't open up Illustrator, look at your layers panel, and ask about what's new. Okay? Whatever's been brought into After Effects, that's all After Effects knows. Okay? So if I modify a layer that's already been placed, then the changed information will show up. But if I add new stuff that After Effects never saw because it was never imported into the software to begin with, I get problems. Okay, not really problems. That stuff just won't show up inside of After Effects. So you'll say, hey, I added a mustache to my scene and it won't show up when I open it in After Effects. And I'll say, did you already import it into After Effects when you added the mustache? And you'll say yes. And I'll say you got to re-import the mustache, or at least import the mustache first. And there's a way to do that, and you're about to see that momentarily. But we have a problem on screen. Beyond the fact that the scissors aren't there, we have that goofy test bar pattern. What does that mean when you see that? Anybody know?
It means I couldn't find it.
Means, yep, were you going to say the same thing?
The information no longer exists, so like because the scissors aren't technically there anymore.
You're both right. Okay? What is happening is that graphic, that test bar, you're going to see it a lot. That's the After Effects placeholder. Okay? Anytime you see that, it means either the thing has been moved or it's been deleted. Okay? Whatever that thing is that the test bars represent. Well, that's crazy, and that means that's a terrible thing that After Effects does. Wrong. It's a great thing, because the reason that test bar is there is so that any animation that I had on that original object, or filters, or effects, After Effects is using the placeholder to remember all of that. So that if I replace that with a different object, all the stuff that I already animated will still be there. Does that make some sense right now? This is all new, so I don't expect you guys to remember this word for word, obviously. But the point is, if and when you see test bars, that's not a bad thing. Even if you open up your entire document and the whole thing is test bars. For instance, I'm going to do that right now. Let's close this project. Okay? And watch how easy it is to freak out After Effects, even though it's not going to really freak out. I'm going to go into the folder that contains this information. After Effects only knows where the file is because it memorized the file path to the Illustrator document. I'm going to take the Illustrator document, I'm going to move it somewhere else, anywhere else. I'm going to go back to After Effects. I'm going to reopen the project that has that already imported. Okay? And After Effects already starts with, whoa, man, we're missing files, all the layers that it was already seeing. And when I click OK again, it looks like text test bar, color bar inception, right? Like, oh no! Okay, we're all test bars. The reason why this is like this is because After Effects is remembering where everything was and the size that it was so that I can find the files and everything can look like it did before. Okay, so you take your project and you take your Illustrator file and you decide, I want to take those home and work on them because Sean's an annoying jackass and the sooner I get this done, the sooner he'll leave me alone. I hope that's not your reason for it, but let's just say that it is. Okay, nobody's laughing. That scares me. So you go home, you open your After Effects file, and you see this. Okay, you know you have the Illustrator file, but at school you kept them both in the same folder. At home, you decided to put all the artwork placed in your After Effects file in a separate folder. That just means the file path has changed, and you just have to redirect After Effects to know where that file is. And that's easy. Okay, if I go into my folder of elements, all I have to do is double-click any one of those, and it'll give me a prompt that will allow me to navigate to my file. I can also, and you're going to have this, and it's going to be freaky when it first happens, and then later you're not even going to care, I could also have 1,000 elements inside that project panel. Okay, 1,000's nothing. You got 10,000 assets in that project panel. Okay, and you don't know which ones After Effects can and can't find. You can go underneath this little magnifying glass right there. This is also in the video too. And you can choose to show only the missing footage inside your project. So all the stuff that it can find will disappear in the project panel, and only the links that are broken that you have to fix will be there. Okay? Either way, when you double-click one of these broken links, okay, footage where it can't find anything, so it's putting up test bars instead, all you have to do is navigate to where that file is. Maybe I've got 200 layers in my Illustrator file, so it says I've got 200 missing files. If it's all in one container, like one Photoshop document or one Illustrator file, once I find the document, it'll fix the rest of the links for me. So I don't have to do this 7 times. I only have to do this once because all 7 layers are in one Illustrator file. Okay? Does that make sense? And it even tried to figure out how to fix the broken scissors thing. Okay? How nice of After Effects. That's so sweet. You're wrong, but you tried. Okay? So this video and this little explanation, when you get working, remember that at the very beginning of this particular video, which is day 3, okay, that we did talk about missing links and stuff. This is going to be a recurring problem. You're going to forget everything that I just told you multiple times, and I'll come over to your computer, and as if I just waved my hand at the screen, I'll be so fast because I'll do this and fix your problem, and you'll go, what the hell was that? And we'll do this a number of times until it starts to make sense, and it will make sense. So don't worry if this happens to you later and you can't remember that there was a solve. Just remember that there is a solve so that you don't commit hara-kiri or think that your file's destroyed and that the world is ending and that everything is terrible. Because that's, unfortunately, for whatever crazy, kooky reason, the go-to answer every time this happens in the first couple of assignments to people that have never used After Effects before. I don't know what it is about test bars, but they see that and think that their project's world is ending. Like, oh my God, it's going to die! No, it's fine. No, it's not. Look! Well, you got to reestablish your links. Click, click, click. Oh, okay, cool, great. So I want to avoid that headache for you guys. Okay, so if you remember that it's fixable, that's good enough for now. And as we go through this over and over, it'll start to make sense. So I'm going to close this up and actually create a new document so that we can go through the import process one more time. So let's close the project. And again, we get everything into After Effects by double-clicking the project panel or going into the import dialog from the file menu. I'm going to click on the document that we're bringing in that I just edited, and I'm going to click on Import As. And if you don't see this, you have to click on the Options tab down here to bring up these options down here at the bottom of our import dialog. I'm going to go underneath Import As where it says Footage and choose Composition Dash Retain Layer Sizes, because that's the option I want, and quite honestly, that's probably going to be the option that you choose always. Okay, it's a rare day when you don't want to bring in the file that you layered as a layered file. Okay, so just get into the habit of doing this every time, no matter what, and the few rare instances where you don't need to do it, you'll remember because they'll be so memorable. Make sure that these options are turned off. We don't want to create a composition inside of a composition. And we don't need a sequence out of our layers inside of Adobe Illustrator. And then click Open, okay, if you're doing this as well, which I think we've all done this already. I'm going to double-click the composition in my project panel. And that's obvious that this is a composition because of the film strip thumbnail that we can see here over on the extreme left-hand side of the screen. It's tiny to see, so it's hard to see on my screen. You'll see it better in the video, and obviously when you're working inside of After Effects. But if I open that up, we've got everything inside of After Effects now, including our left and right scissors, ready to go for animation, so that's cool. We've got our goofy sewing machine that I added at the last minute, and it looks like I added it in the last minute. And what we're going to do is begin to set up the timing for our animation inside of After Effects. And before we do that, we're going to talk a little bit about timing. Okay, After Effects is a relatively simple tool to use. Okay, and I say that with a pause because everything that we're going to see tonight is going to make you think that statement is insane. Okay, yes, it's a complex piece of software. Yes, there's a lot of bells, buttons, and whistles. Yes, there's a bunch of terms and tools and techniques that you have to begin to understand over time. But these are all a means to an end. Okay, the simple purpose of After Effects is allow you to make things move. Okay, make things animate, make things change over time. That should and hopefully will become your mantra when it comes to learning this software. It's very easy with any software, especially After Effects, to fall into the rabbit hole of, ooh, what can I do based on this YouTube video that I saw from that 15-year-old in Cambodia, where I can make, that exact effect from the last Star Wars movie, or ooh, I can buy that fancy plug-in and make that other really cool effect happen from that other franchise movie, that Marvel movie, okay? We don't want to get caught up in the frosting. We want to learn how to bake the cake, okay? And when we're dealing with animation, motion is the most important thing that we need to focus on. And you're going to see that tonight firsthand with not only the examples I'm going to show you, but with the rules that I'm going to introduce to you concerning motion. Okay? And they're not rules that you're going to need to write down because they're going to be all over the place on the internet for you to find once you know what those rules are. Okay? But regarding After Effects and rules and motion, that means if we understand the techniques to animate, in other words, the base techniques, how to set a keyframe, how to manipulate the keyframe, how to control our timeline, how to edit the composition window, how to combine tasks to make our lives easier by using compositions within compositions. We call those nested compositions or pre-comping. How to use parenting, and parenting, hint, hint, is what we call grouping, like we would do in Adobe Illustrator, or layer sets, like we would create in Photoshop. If we understand those base concepts and how things are supposed to move based on reality and physics, you're already a genius level animator with After Effects. Everything after that's semantics. Everything after that is one more plug-in that you have to spend 5 minutes trying to understand. Okay? Because everything we do in After Effects is based on that premise. Because, duh, it's motion software. Okay? So how we set a keyframe for any of our 5 base layer transforms, which are position, scale, rotation, opacity, and anchor point, how we set a keyframe by turning on the stopwatch there is how we set a keyframe for any of the other tools inside of After Effects. So every other plugin, every other effect, every other whatever you want to call it, it's the same stopwatch. It's just a different flavor of result. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, good. So the first thing we're going to look at tonight, because if that's the case, Sean, then we need to understand what the hell motion is when you're dealing with animating, and you're right. The first thing we're going to do tonight is talk about blocking our shot. Okay? In this case, we know a number of things going into this project. We know that we're using this logo, and we know exactly how the pieces have been broken apart because we did that. Okay? The next thing we need to figure out is how to introduce our logo. In other words, it's going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, our little story that we're telling. So we have to figure out what those parts are. Now, if we go back to the reference that you guys have available inside the supplemental folder, I'm going to open up clip 2. I'm going to mute this bad boy, and I'm going to let it loop so that we can talk to this for a couple of seconds, and I'm going to jump ahead to right before this part and let this play. Okay? And let's full screen this for a second. So if we watch these logos, you'll notice that they're not on screen at all, then they are, then they leave again. Right? This is what you guys are going to do with your logos. You're going to animate them on screen so that people can see the badge, the insignia, the logo, and then you're going to animate it back off screen again. Okay? And you've got up to 10 seconds to do that. Okay? That means you're going to bring everything on. It's going to sit on screen for probably 3 seconds or so because we want people to be able to read it. Okay? And then after that, you're going to animate everything away. So it's going to move on, hang out, and then move away, okay, or off. Now, looking at these logos that are animating on screen and thinking about that, let's now think about the order in which each one of these elements come on, like premium there, okay, vintage quality premium. Let's back that up. And I'm going to pause it right when it starts to come on, and we're going to walk through this frame by frame for a second. Okay. So if we look at this frame by frame, what's the first thing that we see? Yeah, that middle strip of the banner, to be specific, right? That's the first thing that pops up. Then, like right after this starts, then the stars start to pop in. At the same time, we start to see the word premium, right? So that pops in. Then we get the rest of the banner, okay? Those little strips that go up and down, and then the parts that kind of go left and right, up and down. And then somewhere in between there, the words quality and vintage, I don't want the volume to go up, also appear, okay, from behind the banner. Okay? So it's not all at once.
You're all right.
Am I okay?
Yeah.
All right. It's not all at once. It feels a little bit like multiple things are happening at once, of course, and they are, but there's an actual order to the elements coming on screen, and then another order to how they leave the screen when it's time to go. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, now let's look at these and think about that. Like, okay, so that means for a little bit of visual excitement, and to drag out the process so it's interesting, we don't want to just go, bang, here it is, right? We want to bring on one thing at a time to create a little bit of interest, okay? Because that's what we do as motion designers, right? We get people interested in wanting to watch, okay? Nobody in here watches cartoons because of how much they hate them or find them boring. If you watch a cartoon, it's because they've done something to interest you enough to want to watch. Okay, and it's the same thing with motion design. We don't move things around because we like giving other people headaches, unless we're doing our jobs badly. we move things around because we're trying to gain the viewer's attention, long story short, okay? And to get someone's attention, you have to make it a positive experience, right? You don't want to slap people in the face because that's the wrong kind of attention, okay? But if you can learn the tools to interest people, then they'll pay attention without you having to even make them or try to make them. Okay? And that's why they are introducing these elements one at a time so that people are comfortable enough to see what's happening, they understand what's occurring. Okay? That's called anticipation, by the way, and we're going to talk about that later on. And then we're also at the same time trying to be clever. Okay? So while we're giving the information properly to everybody so they can digest it in a positive way, we're also trying to be clever about how we do that to add that little bit of interest, okay? So it's not just here is the thing like every other thing. It's like, how can I bring my object in to make it visually interesting and pleasing to the eye, okay? So we're going to be talking about both of those things, but for now we're going to just focus on the first thing that I brought up, okay, which is trying to time out our animation by blocking the shot, okay? So our elements have to come in one at a time. We're not going to make them all show up at once. So using my logo as a guide, okay, and thinking about kind of a lot of the elements that we've been looking at, how should we approach introducing this logo? Okay, one element at a time, sure, but I could just go down the list and turn things on one at a time, right? Like I can just go boop, 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 boop. But that makes for a pretty weird animation, right? Because you really don't know what we're looking at until almost the very last thing shows up, right? So what would be the proper order to introduce all of these elements, and why is that?
Probably start from the back to the front.
Start from the back to the front. So in this case, that would be our little banner elements, right? So if I turn these off, and I'm saying banner because I actually named them banner. That would be the burst too, but let's do that. Let's turn these on in the exact opposite order because that's kind of back to front. And that actually feels better, doesn't it? I mean, it needs tweaking, but that's what this is all about. But definitely it made a little more sense. Why? I couldn't hear you. What'd you say?
Because it builds.
There's a building process, yes. Okay. Either way, though, you could argue that both build. Okay. So it's a good point, but I think we need to go a little bit further. The building process for the second one made more sense than the first one, and I can just tell you that because it's true. I'm not going to make you guess at that. My question to you guys and gals is, why is that? What do you notice about that process that we just went through and, let's say, these videos that we just watched? Because they're kind of doing the same thing, right? If we go back to, there's a badge after awesome here, right? And we started with that big shape in the background. That was the first thing that we saw. Okay, yeah.
Is it more attention getting and
Yeah.
more substance?
Yeah, it raises attention and it focuses the audience. Okay, there's a term that you're going to get real familiar with in all of your motion classes that will be a really big deal in the advanced version of this class right at the beginning, and that's called eye trace. Okay, not like iPad or iPhone, but I'm talking about EYE, your eyes or your audience's eyes, eye trace. Okay, getting people to look where you want them to look and understand what's happening when they're doing that. Okay, and in the background, because that's just typically how we tend to design, these elements that are behind everything else, they just happen to be the brightest colored and largest elements within the scene. Okay, they are the most eye-catching. right? So if we start with those, then we're already getting people's attention, and then we can focus in on the details. Does that make sense? So I wouldn't start necessarily with the smallest object, right? Like I wouldn't start with the scissors, okay, to build this logo, unless I was doing something really engaging with those scissors that caught people's eye. Like, watch these scissors. Like if I had those fly on screen, like chomping like Pac-Man, okay, and then landing in the center and the rest of the logo builds around that, well, that would be eye-catching. That would create eye trace. That would create visual interest, and there would be a logic there, right? So that would be okay. So there's no hard and fast rule that says always go back to front or large to small or small to large or yellow to green or orange to blue. The rule is build a story that makes sense, that people can follow because you're leading them to something, right? If you're trying to get them to look at the logo that you're building, then you might start with a big giant graphic explosion to get them to look on the screen where you want them to look. Like, how many ESPN watchers do we have in here? One. I guess two. All right. Well, almost every ESPN Super for any episode or any score for any game has some sort of a news. Shows do this all the time, so not just ESPN, like any like nightly news or news show, there's always those bright, colorful graphics that say like, you know, ESPN Sports Center, and they animate in 3 dimensions, or, you know, Channel 4 nightly news, and they animate on screen, and in some way they focus your attention to the bumper, right? You know, you're not looking at that weird gear off in the distance in that 3-dimensional scene, right? Or that cool reflection of that pseudo-futuristic environment way off in the distance of that 3D scene. You're looking square at the title that they're showing you, and eye trace is how they get you there. Does that make sense? That's what we're talking about right now. So looking at this logo, and I'll bring the whole thing back, what we want to do is figure out which elements create visual interest and focus people's attention. One route could be to bring in the banner behind everything first, okay? But I think for this particular logo, we're going to start with the scissors, okay? So let's grab the elements that aren't the scissors, and let's just pull them down the timeline, okay? A very similar logo designed in a very similar fashion with a lot of the same parts might not start this way, which is why I'm going through this explanation. Does that make sense? Because it really depends on the message. Okay? Now, I just dragged these down the timeline so that they don't start at the very beginning. And I'm going to lock my scissors layers so that they don't move when I grab the rest of these remaining pieces. Okay? And you can see that my timeline right now is only about 4 seconds long. So I'm going to hit Command K and change the length of my timeline. I want you guys to work in a 10-second composition. Okay? Now to change the duration, and I again hit Command K to bring up composition settings. The composition, if you don't remember, is the actual timeline and window that you're looking at here. Okay? To edit the composition settings, i.e. change the length, make it bigger or smaller, when I go into this window, I've got all these tools here to do that. I want the frame rate to be either 29.97 or 30 frames per second. Okay? I would prefer that you just choose 30 frames per second because of, well, for lack of a better description, easiness. Okay? It's probably going to be a lot easier for you guys to work with full frames without the explanation of why is there a 0.97 frame in this file per second. That doesn't make sense. And it does and doesn't, and goes into a big long explanation about how broadcast television used to work versus how it works right now, and I don't want to get into all that. So 29.97 is a standard frame rate that you could use. So if you're going to use it and tell me that it's correct to use so and argue with me, I'll probably say fine and then huff away. But I would prefer that you work at 30 frames per second because that's just going to make sense. Why not 15? Why not 24? Why not 23.967? Okay, or 976, excuse me. Those are all frame rates for various devices. 30 frames per second will stream and look beautiful on the internet. And that's where this stuff's probably going to go because you're going to want to show samples. And if you show samples anywhere, it's not going to be on somebody's TV. It'll be through the internet to somebody's TV or phone or computer, maybe, or laptop, probably. Does that make sense? The final thing is duration, and we can change that right down here. And any time code, when we work with video or animation, works based on what's called SMPTE time code. And I'm pointing to that right now, and I should point to it in the video as well. Okay, so these numbers that you see, they're known as SMPTE time code. And you don't need to remember the first part, just remember time code. Well, what's SMPTE mean? It means something you don't need to know right now, and we'll talk about that later. Time code is always hours, minutes, seconds, frames. Okay, that's how time code works. So that first number is hours, and then there's either a colon or a semicolon, and that second bracketed two-digit number is going to be minutes. The third is seconds, and then the last two-digit number furthest to the right is always frames. Okay? Well, what do you mean frames? Well, we were talking about 30 frames per second. That means in 1 second there's 30 images that we call frames. Okay? And that means that those two numbers in our animation could go from 0 all the way to 29 before they cycle back to 0 again. Okay, why 0 to 29 and not 1 to 30, Sean? Because we're going to tell you later. Because that's another one of those things that you don't need to know right now. Okay, but time code is important to understand because if we're going to set the length of our animations, we need to know how to do so. If I highlight the entire value inside the duration field, I can simply type 10. But notice, and you can do this on your computer if you want to see it a little bit better. Notice that if I just type 10, that little number to the right, which is showing me what I'm going to get as far as time code, it says our animation is only 10 frames long right now. Okay, so we don't want a 10 frame animation, we want a 10-second animation. 10 seconds is 300 frames. So all I have to do is type 2 zeros after these seconds. So if I highlight the whole value, whatever the length is in seconds, I need a 25-second animation. Then we would type 25 and then add 2 zeros. Okay? No semicolons or asterisks or colons. You don't need to do that. The software does that. Right? You don't have to go in and highlight whichever column you want to work with. Just highlight the whole thing, all of the time code, and then type how long you want it to be. I want it to be 52 seconds. Okay, 52, and then 2 zeros. And then you're done. And you'll know you're done right because you can look to the right and it will tell you. Yep, that's 10 seconds. Cool, Sean. I'm going to click OK. Okay, so now my animation's the proper length, but my footage needs to stretch to the end of the timeline. This will happen to people. Okay, and when it does, you'll look at it or someone will look at it and say, oh my God, After Effects decided that my animation's not going to be long enough. Okay, and we can definitely fix that very easily. All we have to do is select all of our layers, go to the end of our timeline, and if I hit the minus key, I'm zooming out of my timeline so I can see the whole thing. Plus key on the keyboard zooms in on the timeline based on the current time indicator. But all I have to do to stretch this footage right here all the way to the end of my timeline is to go to the end of the timeline, and I can do that by hitting the end key, or I can simply just grab the current time indicator and drag it all the way there. Once this is there, and notice how we don't have any of these blocks going all the way to the end, so the screen went blank. Where these blocks end for each one of these layers, okay, that's the end of the footage according to After Effects, right? So when I stretched out the timeline, I need to stretch out our footage, obviously, so it reaches the end. If I had a video clip that I was working with, I wouldn't be able to do this the same way because video has its own timeline. If I had another composition, same problem. It has its own timeline, so I can't make the length whatever I want. But with still images, like the pieces of this logo, they can be infinity in length in After Effects because they're just still images. I haven't even done anything with them yet, so there's nothing to really break, let's say, if I stretch these out in length as far as how long they show up on screen. So all I have to do is select all these, hold down the Option key and hit the right bracket key. And that takes the length of each one of those selected layers and it flushes it with my current time indicator, which is all the way over at the end of the animation. Okay, so that's how I would stretch all these pieces to reach the end of the timeline. What I've done, though, is I've made this long enough to first introduce the scissors in some way and then bring in the other elements. So I need to keep moving the other elements down the timeline. And I really think that retro style should happen later along with the sewing machine. So sewing and type, I want to drag these down to at least maybe 3 seconds or 4 seconds. Just get them down the timeline, right? So this happens, then that, then that. Okay? Now, how am I allowing the animation to kind of roughly play? Okay, and when I say roughly play, it's building a preview and then it's trying to play it back in what we call real time. Real time is, the same time that you would see if it were playing on the television and not inside of software. Okay? And that's a thing because sometimes your animation file is going to be so dense that it's going to play like 1 frame every second as opposed to 30 frames per second like the composition is set up for, at least here. And when that happens, After Effects has to build the preview before it plays smoothly. Okay? And we'll talk more about that as we continue. But right now, when I play this back in real time, okay, we can feel a real lull in the action in between the first reveal of the background elements and then the final reveal of the sewing machine and retro style. So we're going to stagger this a little bit more. Okay, we'll take the burst and maybe have that happen before the banners, right? So the scissors show up. And let's even select all of these pieces except for background. Let's lock that. Let's select all of these pieces and maybe start the scissors at around 1 second just so that we've got time to animate them into position, right? So at 1 second they've landed and then the rest of this happens. And let's say that that burst happens first and then maybe the banner and then banner line happen after that. So banner line might happen a few frames later. So we'll push these down. We can back this up and hit the space bar again. Okay, that's starting to feel a little bit better. And let's say we want the sewing machine to land last. So we'll pull the type forward. And then the sewing machine further down the timeline. Okay. And let's play this back from the beginning again. So we haven't set one keyframe yet, but we have partially figured out the opening of our story. Okay. And based on eye trace and everything that we described earlier, if we look at this and say, yeah, this makes sense, I feel this. It starts with the scissors, and as the scissors animate up, we've got these cool burst lines that are doing things behind the scissors, and then the banners kind of grow around those burst lines, and maybe they're turning or moving, and then retro style animates in, and then we end on the sewing machine, and we're done. Okay, and that sounds logical, that feels logical, this feels pleasing. I'm not confused until the very last item is revealed as to what's happening. And if you can look at how you configure your elements to be introduced one at a time so that you don't feel like there's a sense of confusion until the last thing shows up, then that'll work. And even though I'm describing this very specifically, you don't necessarily have to put as much thought as I'm describing, as long as the ideas are there, right? Does this make sense? Yeah. Is this logical? Yeah. Do I look at this and know what's happening and why it's happening? Yeah. Okay, good. Does that make sense, the way that I say that? You just have to understand the concepts and then apply them. They don't have to be noodled about the way that I'm noodling these right now, just to make sure you get the point. Okay? What I want you to do, and I'm going to let you do this for a little bit, and then we'll come back to chatting about After Effects. Since we've just gone through the process of creating what we refer to as an animatic by blocking our shot, I want you to do this with your logo. Get it into After Effects. Make sure that the duration is the correct length. Start to move the elements up and down the timeline so that you can kind of begin to sense what's going to happen in the animation. While you're doing that, go to your supplemental folder, take a look at some of those animations. Okay, think about what they are doing. You know, do these objects scale up from nothing? Do these objects fly off the screen? Do they appear from nowhere? Do they show up from behind each other? Okay. Are there certain objects that animate a specific way each and every time? Okay, and does that make sense? Some of you guys and gals have arrows, for instance, in what you've created. Okay, an arrow is a perfect example of what I'm alluding to when I tell you to take a look at these animations. Because if you've got an arrow, what does conventional wisdom tell you about how you're going to animate the arrow? What's the arrow going to do in your shot? You've got an arrow that looks like this. I'm going to get rid of this beautiful penmanship. That's really well written. I feel terrible. But I've got an arrow in my shot that looks like this, right? It goes like this. And then I've got another arrow kind of mirrored to the one that I just drew. And it looks like that, and it looks like that. So I've got two arrows in the shot. What's conventional wisdom tell me about how they should animate into the shot?
It's always going to move in the direction that it's pointing.
Right. They're going to fly into place more than likely, right? Because, duh, it's what we expect. If they fly in from the sides, in other words, this arrow flies in from over here, you know, and it just kind of lands this way, and the other arrow does the same thing, that's going to be weird. Okay? It doesn't mean you have to do that if you have arrows, like I guess I'm locked into flying these in like this. It just means that if you have a different idea in mind, it's got to be better than the obvious. Because if it's not, people are going to go, I wonder why that person did that. And they're not going to understand the meaning of the animation. Okay? In other words, we want to have a reason for what we do. Even when we're dealing with goofy graphic shapes, what's the reason for this circle to be in the center of the screen? If you can come up with one, it's going to make the animation even better. And you haven't had to worry about learning fancy plugins or amazing tools that nobody needs or any of that stuff yet. Okay? So let's take some time, play around with blocking the shot, building your animatic. And when we come back from doing that for a little bit and a break, we're going to look at keyframing. And I'm going to introduce you to the most important set of motion principles you're ever going to see. And you'll see them many, 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 many times after this if you haven't already seen them once or twice. And that's the 12 Principles of Animation by Frank and Ollie, two animators that worked at Disney for about a millennia until they retired. They wrote a book called The Illusion of Life, and that turned into the Bible of animation, essentially. And within that book, this giant, thick, super big book, are the 12 Principles of Animation. And we're going to just talk a lot about those as we learn how to animate inside of After Effects. Because the more you know about those principles, the better your work will be. And there's a little movie that I want to show you that takes about 3 minutes. And it's all cartoon-based. So it's fun to watch. It's not going to be like a documentary about the 1920s when they used to build the type by hand and sculpt it out of the wood. Like, we're not doing that. Okay, this animation will be fun to watch and beneficial for what we're doing in this very class, okay? So let's take a break before we get into the second phase of this and then come back and work for a little bit, and then we'll start animating this logo. Boom, 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 boom. Okay, we're going to get started again. So when we left off, you guys were using the little bit of knowledge that I handed over in the way of moving items around on your timeline so that you could start to see the plan in action, right? Okay, what's going to happen first? What's going to happen second? What's going to close this down, right? So the beginning, the middle, the end, okay? It's an important concept to get our heads around because understanding that means you understand a little bit about the whole entire process of animation, which is to tell a story, okay? We're not just randomly dumping shapes into a blender and then how they appear is how they appear. If that's all that motion designers did, there'd be an app for it, and I wouldn't be here teaching this class, and you wouldn't be here taking it, okay? Motion requires a deeper understanding of how to tell a story, okay? And if you understand how to tell a story through motion, then learning software like After Effects or Cinema 4D or any other tool that allows for animation to occur, or drawing animation by hand, becomes a hell of a lot easier because you know exactly what you are going for. If you can already, and some of you are really good at this, okay? If you can already look at your subject and see and break out the story, like, you know what? I want this to appear, and it's going to shine. And then when it shines, this is going to draw, and then that's going to dance, and that's going to be the end of the thing, and that's how it's supposed to look. Wow, that's involved, and it sounds really good. That's what a director does, okay? You know how we talk about movies and we talk about directors, animation directors in particular, they don't get to be, and before I get into this quick story, it will be a quick story, contrary to what you may have heard from other people. Animation directors don't get to just direct, right? Like, ooh, I was an actor for 10 years, so now I'm a director. No, you're not. Because animation directors have to know everything about animation. They have to know how everything is made. They have to know how everything gets manipulated so they know when and where to jump in and right the ship, okay? You are your own little animation director for your tiny little movie company, okay, of one person with After Effects, right? So if you can look at your design or the design your client gives you or your job supervisor, and you can clearly start to define the process, okay, then it's just a matter of executing it, okay, which again becomes much more easy than just learning every single solitary tool there is in the toolbox in case you might need to apply it, which is the very institutionalized approach to learning, right? That's how we learn kind of everything, even in grade school. We start off, first you learn every letter there is in the alphabet, even though there are several that you'll probably almost never use, right? How many times do you really use the letter Z? Okay, it's a great letter, it's a cool sound, but other than going to the zoo, riding on a zebra, or the noise you make when you're sleeping, probably not a letter that you use when you're writing things, right? So if we were assigning importance to letters, we would probably say, well, it's really important to learn basically all the letters that you always see on Wheel of Fortune, right? How many people have ever seen Wheel of Fortune, by the way? Raise your hand before I get into an analogy where I have to explain television. Good, a lot of people have. So you already know, like your R's, your N's, your M's, your S's, your T's for consonants, right? And then for vowels, your E's, your A's, your O's, your I's. You don't really need to worry too much about Y because that's never on the board, or it very rarely is. Okay? It's kind of the same thing here. I could teach you every tool there is in After Effects and how to use it, and that would mean absolutely very, very little if you didn't know when and how to use those tools, okay, in the context of telling a story. So let's look at some good information on how to understand telling a story. We know how to break apart a story. We know how to think about the elements, but as animation directors, we need to know more than that. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to Vimeo for a quick second. And I'm going to scroll down past a bunch of samples that I've uploaded of various things that I've done. This list could go on forever because Sean doesn't throw anything away. And here we go. I've got a video that I made that I think is really good. It talks about the 12 principles of animation, and it's really short. And it's got Pixar characters, and I even brought those up earlier. Isn't that cool? I'm not going to show you that. Instead, I'm going to show you a much better video that inspired me to make this video, okay, by an animator that works on the other side of the world, okay, and understands that this information that you're about to see is just as important as I think it is, because it's not Sean's opinion. This is a standard, what you're about to see, okay? So I'm going to turn the old sound up, make sure we can really hear this. I'm going to click on this link so we can get over to Vincenzo's work. I'm going to pause this, make this full screen. And what you're about to watch, and the narrator actually explains this right up front, is the 12 principles of animation that I was talking about earlier. These principles, and don't bother worrying about writing this down because I'm not going to quiz you on this stuff, and you're going to hear it so much that you're never ever going to need to remember this. And I actually told a couple of people this story, so I'm going to try and make it real quick. The Illusion of Life was written by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Okay, those names don't ring a bell, but let me ask you guys a question. How many people in here have seen Incredibles? Raise your hand. How many people in here have seen Iron Giant? Raise your hand. Then you have seen and heard from Frank and Ollie Johnston, literally. Okay, because those two co-authors of the 12 Principles of Animation worked for Disney for a millennia, where Brad Bird worked. They also taught at CalArts for a millennia, off and on, where Brad Bird went to school. And Brad Bird believed in not only the principles, but their tutelage overall, so much so that he put them in both movies. Okay? They were really old when they were in both movies. In fact, that means that I mentioned earlier that one of them died in the early 90s. That's not the case. They both died in the early 2000s because they'd already started work on Incredibles when their voices were filmed. But in Incredibles, end scene of the movie, bad guys got their asses whipped, the family's slapping high fives, and there's these two old guys that just show up out of nowhere, and they're like, "Hey, that was old school. No school like the old school," and they laugh. You guys remember that? Did you ever wonder, why the hell are these two randos just eating up screen time right in the middle of the movie? That's Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. In Iron Giant, beginning of the movie, when, what's his name, from the FBI is investigating the train that had crashed, or supposedly crashed. There were two old guys, an engineer and a conductor, and they were, on the train when Iron Giant basically ran into it and ate part of the train. And the one guy's like, "Go ahead, Frank, tell him what you saw." And the other guy's like, "I saw a big, moving metal man." That was Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston, And they're both, for some crazy reason, toy train aficionados, which is why they made it a train and made one the conductor and one the engineer, because that's how much Brad Bird thought those guys were important. He wanted to immortalize them forever in film, to make sure that anyone who ever asks, who the hell are these old guys that get screen time, that are in the story and then gone again, that the answer of who they are comes out, okay? Which I think is really sweet, obviously, and also, obviously, really doesn't seem to matter to you guys, and I kind of don't blame you. But I say that because these guys, they're that beloved by animators everywhere forever, even all the way up to stuff you see today and things that haven't even come out yet that are being worked on right now because of the 12 principles of animation. Okay, this jackass named Walt rounded up 9 people that he thought were talented in this weird new field called animation. He shoved them in a room and said, "Start drawing, guys. We're going to make money." Okay? There were no rules. Okay? They were going to make movies in full color with drawings. They were supposed to compete with Gone with the Wind and Casablanca. I mean, originally, cartoons were not developed to be kids' fare. Those movies in the theater, like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White, they were meant to captivate audiences the way that Avengers captivates a much larger audience than kids today. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, he just kind of sat all that weight on 9 people and said, make me money, let's do this, okay? And through trial and error, they were very successful. But animation, especially back then, is very grueling. So trial and error sucks in any regard, but super sucks when everything you do takes forever to actually accomplish. So as soon as they found something that worked, they literally said, write that shit down! Okay, so that they wouldn't have to rediscover whatever that concept was later. And over a period of about 40 years, that became the Disney playbook, okay, their secret sauce. And then once Frank and Ollie left Disney and they decided to write a book in the early 80s, that became the book, The Illusion of Life. Okay, and that book is like this thick and reads like stereo instructions from the afterlife, like Beetlejuice, because those guys are animators, not writers. But there's tons of great stuff in there, and also the 12 principles of animation. The 12 principles take all those rules that those original 9 guys figured out worked and streamlines them so that other animators don't have to suffer the way that they did. Okay, they can just read the rules, learn how to apply those, and they already know just as much as the original 9 did after years of hospitalization and strokes and whatever other brilliant and awful things that happened to them. Does that make sense? So this little animation describes the 12 principles that have been watered down from all that toil into just the frosting. Okay? You do not have to memorize these right now. Again, you're going to hear about them a ton if you stay in motion design. Okay, from everybody you ever run into, because this is like water cooler stuff, as you can tell, as much as it is important facts. Water coolers are these big devices, for those that don't know, because I keep forgetting the world has changed, where people used to go and congregate. Now it's all on the phone, and now I sound like Frank and Ollie when I say that. But long story short, you're not going to ever run out of information about the 12 principles. But if you can see them as you're beginning to learn animation right now and understand what they mean, even slightly, that's already going to improve your ability to animate and get better at your craft. And you'll see why, I promise you, after we get through this and then jump back into After Effects, okay?
The following has been paraphrased from The Illusion of Life by Frank Thomas and Ollie Johnston. Squash and stretch. This action gives the illusion of weight and volume to a character as it moves. Anticipation. Prepares the audience for a major action the character is about to perform. Each major action is preceded with specific moves that anticipate for the audience what is about to happen. Staging. It's the presentation of an idea so that it is clear. Straight ahead and pose to pose. Pose to pose is charted with key drawings done at intervals throughout the scene. Straight ahead animation starts at the first drawing and works drawing to the end of a scene. Follow through and overlap. When the main body of the character stops, all other parts continue to catch up to the main mass. Nothing stops all at once. Slow in and slow out. As the action starts, we have more drawings near the starting pose, 1 or 2 in the middle, and more drawings near the next pose. Fewer drawings make the action faster, and more drawings make the action slower. Arcs. All actions, with few exceptions, follow an arc or slightly circular path. Arcs give animation a more natural action and better flow. Secondary action. It's an additional action in the scene used as a supplement of the main one in order to reinforce it and add more dimension. Timing. More drawings between poses slow and smooth the action. Fewer drawings make the action faster and crisper. Timing maintains the appearance of an object abiding by the laws of physics. Exaggeration. remain true to reality, just presenting it in a wilder, more extreme form. Solid drawings. It means taking into account forms in three-dimensional space, giving them volume and weight. Appeal. It's a quality of charm, able to please the viewer's eyes. It's the charisma of the action.
Cute, right? A lot of that right now not only probably doesn't mean very much because A, we don't really know how to animate yet, but just based on the fact that you've probably already figured out that they're also quoting Frank and Ollie from the 80s, which means when they're talking about frames, they're talking about drawings. And they're even using the words, like drawing and various drawings and more drawings here and less drawings there. Our first inclination is to go, well, those principles don't matter because they're talking about hand-drawn art. Well, if that's the case, why the hell did Brad Bird want to put both Frank and Ollie into two separate animations that didn't have a lot of hand-drawing in them to begin with? Incredibles had none, except for the very very ending of the movie. And the Iron Giant from Iron Giant was a 3D model that was animated, and then they took all those frames and painted over them to make them look like cell animation. Okay, and it's because these concepts do carry over directly to digital animation, and you're about to see how they do when we start playing around with After Effects. And that's by design. The people that built the software gave us tools so that traditional animators would know what to do with them. So if you understand the concepts that apply to traditional animation, then you're learning concepts that apply to digital animation as well. And you'll see exactly how, and it won't be one of those things where I say that's how it is and it's not really how it is. You'll say, oh, of course, yeah, now I see. So back inside of After Effects, thinking about some of those principles now, let's look at keyframing. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to grab my scissors. I'm going to try and sit down to do this because I'm quite frankly tired of standing. I'm going to grab my scissors because they're the first thing that come on screen, and I'm going to animate them into the center of the screen. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to do with the scissors besides just move them. But for now, we'll stick with just the movement of the scissors flying into place. Not chomping, but flying into place. There's a couple of ways that we can move these scissors together. And by scissors right now, I'm talking about the left piece and then also the right piece. Okay. Now, if you look at your timeline, I was just able to isolate one specific layer, and I did that with this column that you see here. So there's the visibility column with the little eyeballs. And then just to the right of that, there's this column that's empty right now with a dot above it. That's our solo column. It does the opposite of what the visibility icon does. If I turn off the visibility to one layer, that one layer disappears. But if I click on the solo switch, everything else but that one layer disappears until I turn that switch off. Okay, so that's what that was. I just want to explain that since I'm playing with it. But we've got a couple of ways that we can try to combine these two elements together so that they animate as one element. And that's going to get us into a couple of the techniques that I brought up earlier. The first technique, which isn't the one we're going to use, but I want to show it to you anyways, I want to animate these objects together, but they both have their own position layer transforms. And remember in the last class we talked about layer transforms, and we said that they were position, rotation, scale, opacity, and anchor point. Okay? Both of these objects have position as a layer transform, which means I can animate both of them by setting keyframes, which many of you know how to do. But I don't want to have to set keyframes for both objects since they're connected, right? Instead, I want to connect these objects together and move them as a group. So to do that, the first method is to parent one object to the other, which is kind of like grouping. I can say, all right, wherever this object goes, you tag along like you're stuck to it. Okay? So I'm going to take scissors right, and I'm going to come over to this column here. And if you don't see these columns the way that I have them on screen, click on this toggle switch at the very bottom, and that should bring up the window that I'm playing with, or the column that I'm playing with on screen. If it doesn't, you can also right-click right on this gray bar, go under columns, and just click next to the item that you want to see. And right now, we're playing with the parent and link column. Okay, so I'm going to grab scissors right, this little shape here, this curly Q, looks like a Cinnabon because I'm getting hungry. I'm going to click on this curly Q, which we call the parent pick whip, and I'm going to drag it to the other side of the scissors. Okay, now if you look in this little menu, it says scissors left here, and that's because scissors right is now glued to scissors left. So if I grab scissors left and I move this, both pieces move now. Okay, but I don't actually want to move this item in this manner, because there's another way that I can make more than one object move together as a group. Okay, and that is through the use of nested compositions or pre-comping. Okay, both terms mean exactly the same thing and are therefore interchangeable, and you will hear people say both. So nested comps and pre-comping, P-R-E-C-O-M-P-I-N-G, okay, they are the same thing, and it just means putting one composition inside of another composition. Okay? Now, how do you do that little trick, Sean? Well, you do it like this. I'm going to grab scissors right and scissors left by selecting one and then shift selecting the other. I'm going to right click, and right down here there's this option to pre-compose those two layers. So I'm going to select that, and this pre-compose window pops up and says, what do you want to call this new composition you're about to make? And I'm going to call it the most obvious thing I can think of, scissors. Duh. Okay. And I've got typically a couple of choices that I can make after this, but for now, to speed this up, we're going to open the composition that's going to contain these two halves of the scissors. So I'm just going to click OK and leave everything as is. And now inside of this composition, which is a separate composition from where all of our other pieces are, we've got just the two scissors on a timeline, okay, in a big comp window, which is the same size as our original comp window. Okay, if you look up top, there's the composition that we created, but it's now connected to the original composition that we started with. So if I click on that, take a look at our timeline. Okay, now we've got this one layer that we can grab and animate as opposed to two, because now this is a composition that contains, if I double click it, this. Okay, so I'm going to take these layers. I know that I want them to essentially stop moving at about 1 second. So I'm going to take these layers, make them start at 0 by selecting them and hitting the the left bracket key. There we go. And then I'm going to click back on this button, and I'm going to take my scissors at 0 in my main timeline or parent timeline, and I'm going to drag them off screen, okay, right down to the bottom. Now the one thing I want you to notice is my scissors are in the center of the screen, right? Basically? Okay. If I zoom in on them though, they're inside of a composition, and the exact center of the composition is where this target is. See this little target? Okay, it looks like a tiny viewfinder you'd see through a scope or something like that, or a target you might see in a video game or like a submarine movie on a screen. This is our anchor point, and that's one of our layer transforms. If I hit the A key, you can see it right there. Okay, I want to move this target so it's right in the center of my scissors, where that hole is, where they animate from, right, when they cut things. To do that, I have to use a special tool up here called the Pan Behind tool. Okay, so I'm going to grab that, And that gives me the ability to move the anchor point. Okay, and I just want to put that anchor point right in the center of the scissors for now, just in case I need it there. Okay, and if I go back into my composition for a second, my scissors composition, let's double click that. Let's zoom in. If we click either one of these objects, we can see that the anchor point, because it's by default in the center of each individual object, and there's two here, okay, I need to move the anchor point for both of these objects as well. Okay, now why would I want to do that? Well, let's bring up rotation, another layer transform, and let's rotate the object. Do we see where scissors left is rotating from? Where is it rotating from?
The anchor point.
The anchor point. So if I want this to look like the scissors are a chomping, I got to get that anchor point right in the center here. Okay? Now, we have to do that for two separate layers. So I'm going to bring up my rulers, Command R, and I'm going to figure out where that center is with my rulers. And they work just like any program that has rulers. So I'm going to pull a horizontal ruler down for that, and a vertical ruler down for this. And that looks about center. And even if it's off even slightly, that's okay, because I'm going to snap both anchor points to that cross. So I'm going to go back to the pan behind tool, which is the Y key. I'm going to snap that first anchor point there. I'm going to click on scissors right and snap that anchor point there. Okay, now when I rotate either one of these, let's bring up rotation for both of these, I can select the layer and hit the R key to do that.
Oh, nice.
Okay, now it looks like these scissors are a cutting. Okay, but that's setup. Let's go back to our animation and talk about movement. Okay, we're playing with the scissors and they require a little bit of setup, so I wanted you to at least see that up front. But we're going to go back to movement. We're going to bring up position, P key on the keyboard. And we know we want the scissors to land in the center of the screen. So at 1 second, and I can click on my time code and type 1 with 2 zeros for frames and then end up right at 1 second. At 1 second, I know that the scissors need to be here because that's what we had originally timed. So I'm going to click the stopwatch for position, and that's going to create our first keyframe where this object is going to live. Okay. Now, if I back up to 0, I can grab this object in the comp window and drag it down. That creates a motion path, and if I play this, ooh boy, I've got animation and I'm done, right? Now I've got the stuff a-cooking, it's a-moving. I can even chomp the old blades if I want to do that. And this is the furthest from done it could be, with exception to adding the first two keyframes, because this motion looks terrible. Okay, it's just robotic motion. It's just the object kind of flying in and then stopping with no rhyme or reason, right? There's no story. Okay, we're not gaining any interest based on the motion of this object. Okay, we don't want it to look robotic. We know that much. Does anybody know what to do to change the keyframes from constant velocity to something that has a ramping or slow in, slow out style motion? I see two sets of hands. Go ahead.
You ease the keyframes.
You set the keyframes to ease. That is correct. And how do we do that?
You would right click on the keyframe and then go to keyframe assistant, and you have 3 choices.
And there's easy ease.
So choose easy ease. Let's
And you would select both of them, actually. Not just
let's do that.
one, just one.
And let's select both. And I think that might have been implied, but either way, we've got eased keyframes. Easing, if you go back to the video we watched, there was a term called slow in and slow out. Now we call it easing, and the software does that for us. They ease our keyframes. So Sean, you added easing, right? You sprinkled on the special sauce. This is now done, correct? Cool, let's play it. Not even close is correct, right? It does move differently. Okay, if I take these scissors and I duplicate them for a second, bring up position, and select these keyframes and just move this duplicate over to the left, and then set these back to linear keyframes, or diamonds, we can definitely see the change in speed. Let's turn these other layers off for a second as well. Right? See how the one with easing, which is the one in the middle, moves differently than the one without easing, which is the one on the right. Okay, now it comes in, speeds up, slows down, and that's cool. And it's better. I think the one in the middle is more interesting than the one on the right, sure. But that's still not what we're talking about, okay? Because we've only scratched the surface. I want to control the way this object shows up. Okay? Sometimes selecting your keyframes and just choosing easy ease is more than enough. But most of the time, you're going to want more control than that over your keyframes and how they introduce whatever you're animating. So let's turn this off. Let's click back on Scissors Duh. Let's click on Position. That highlights our keyframes. And we're going to go to this graphic that you're going to get really familiar with and probably hate for a while, and then grow to love more than life itself, and that is a slight exaggeration, but not by much. This is the graph editor. And I'm going to click that button, and that brings up this window that we see that takes the place of our layers on the timeline. And I'm going to hit the plus key to zoom in to Graph Editor. And then I'm going to pull this over, and we're looking at the value graph right now. Okay? And later on, value graph is going to be the graph that we use for almost everything. But for now, value graph, when we're animating position without separating dimensions, is really hard to do because we don't have what we need, and what we need are Bezier handles. Okay? But right now you can see this curve along the y-axis. Okay, that's the green curve. The red curve is the x-axis, and nothing's changing. It's not moving side to side, which is x. It's moving up and down, which is y. So we're seeing that motion measured in the form of a graph. And when this object starts moving, it's very slow at first, and then it speeds up, and then it slows down again. Notice how in the areas where it slows down or speeds up from being slow, the line is more or less horizontal or angling toward being horizontal. Where it's more vertical, like this section where it's very diagonal, leaning toward vertical, the object moves faster. Okay? Now, if we go back to our video, it was expertly done by Cento here, Vincenzo. Let's jump to I think right around here. Yeah. If we play this without sound for a second, and we look at the graphic, okay, see how there's more what we call drawings there, less in the middle, and more drawings there? That's because we're showing these areas for a longer period of time in the animation. That's why you need more drawings, right? So if it's a 10-frame animation, 1, 2, and 3 are being spent showing the object on the left. 4 and 5 and 6 are covering the distance, let's say, of getting the object from A to B. And then 7, 8, 9 are just showing the thing at the other side of the screen landing. This is our graph on Y. We can see that here, right? So with this line kind of bunched together up top here, this is basically the distance being traveled, because we're showing the distance in pixels, which is the value that's changing, right? And we get all the way to almost 10 frames, well, a little shorter than that, maybe 7 frames, before we travel any of this distance, right? And then from there all the way to there, we travel a lot. And then from here just to there, which is almost a third of the time, we travel that tiny little distance to get the rest of the way. Okay. Now, I'm going to click on this button and switch over to the speed graph, because when we're animating using X and Y together, we use the speed graph to control the motion. Okay. And I'm going to take this layer, I'm going to duplicate it again. I'm going to bring up position. I'm going to select the keyframes. I'm going to be on one of the keyframes, and I'm going to slide this to the left this time. Okay, so now we've got two of these showing up still. And let's take this one and put it at the bottom. And let's grab this one. So both of these have ease keyframes, but we're going to change the middle one by editing the speed graph inside of Graph Editor. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is kind of the inverse, but it's really kind of the same thing that we just saw on the value graph, because now we're dealing with speed. Okay, so velocity. Where the graph is flat, that's where the object is barely moving. There's almost no velocity. Where the graph is very vertical or bumpy, hilly, whatever you want to call this, that's where lots of motion is happening. So notice how originally it looked like one of the golden arches, right? But I'm going to take this handle and drag it all the way this way, and this handle and drag it all the way that way. And then if I play this back, same two objects, same motion, okay, in the sense that we're going from A to B, two very different looks, okay? Now it almost looks like a dagger's being shot across the screen, right? These are sharp scissors. Maybe we want that, okay? Maybe we want the scissors to come in and stop abruptly, okay? So let's drag this handle like that and have them start off really slow. Boink. Okay? Now we've got real control over how one object gets from A to B. Okay, we can control the timing of the object, the spacing of the frames. Going back to this illustration right here, that's showing how much distance happens between these individual drawings. If I go back to After Effects, you can see that on what we call the motion path. Okay, this line that we keep seeing but I haven't defined yet, that's the motion path. We can use that to change how this object gets from A to B by changing these handles. Okay, and we'll talk about that probably in another class because we're going to run out of time pretty soon. But more importantly, with this selected, you can see those dots, right? And those dots are the different frames on the timeline. Okay, so if we back this up, you can see that down here, those dots are a lot closer together than they are up here. Okay, that means that the animation's much slower down here because the frames are closer together, just like the graphic we saw in that video. This is the 12 principles of animation at work right inside of After Effects. Okay, and with Graph Editor and tools like the value graph, which we're going to get into in the next class, and the speed graph like you're seeing right now, we can really finesse how these objects show up, okay? So going back to what we created on screen so far, if I click on Scissors Duh, this top layer, and make it visible again like I just did, that's basic linear keyframes that you're going to see on the right. On the left, you're going to see just basic easing, where you select your keyframes and set them to easy ease. And then in the middle is us controlling the motion using Graph Editor. Right? And we can automatically see that at least with the center object, there's definitely a logic behind what's happening there. That feels like somebody animated it. The other two feel like I selected an option in PowerPoint and boom, I got an animation. Okay? Is that starting to make sense? So as we continue through the first couple of assignments, okay, or at least this assignment and the exercises that are going to be a part of this assignment, we're going to get heavily into making Graph Editor do what we want it to do, at least to a given point. Okay, so that we can do things like add secondary animation and overlapping action and oscillations and wobbliness and squash and stretch and all the kind of fun things that'll make your animation work without needing any fancy plugins or any kind of crazy stuff that only big money can buy. Okay? Now, we didn't talk about matting yet. We didn't talk about masking yet. We will do that on Thursday. But beyond talking about those topics and me taking breaks to come up front and show you guys little things, we're going to try and spend the class working with these techniques that we've started to see. Okay, so what can we do to make our animations work? Well, we can take the 5 layer transforms that every layer has, and we can look for ways to introduce the elements using keyframes and playing around with their values in Graph Editor. And I'm going to demo the value graph probably right away in the next class. The other thing that we haven't gotten to yet that I really want to show you is, now that we know grouping and pre-comping a little bit, we can use masks and mats to help reveal things using those elements. Okay, so if you go back to the examples that you saw, you know how some objects ran through each other and disappeared, or an object would fly behind another object and not come out the other side, it was just gone. We'll be able to use masks just like you use masks in Photoshop and Illustrator to do the same thing here. And we make objects to create that kind of masking, or we use other objects in our scene, our composition, to create that masking. We call those mats, M-A-T-T-E. Okay, so you'll see that. If you're curious, because you just can't wait until the next class, you guys have a sister class, and I told them this last night. You have a sister class, the exact same class, just taught on a different day and time. Not really a different time, but different day. And that's on Mondays and Wednesdays. Their albums on Vimeo, their lecture album, is the same password as yours. Okay, so if you ever want to hear me say something slightly differently, or see if I said anything to them that I didn't say to you, or vice versa, you can always log into that lecture album and pull from that as well. It's basically the exact same everything, but some people like variety. So there you go. You can go through those. I think in last night's demo I actually got to matting, but I didn't talk about pre-comping. So you know about pre-comping, and they'll learn about that tomorrow. And they know about matting. You'll learn about that Thursday. But other than subtle little differences like that, it's basically the same stuff. Okay? So that's all I got for tonight, and we're basically running out of time. So make sure that you save where you're at. If you decide to work from home, make sure that everything you're using is inside of a folder. Lift that whole folder and copy that. Don't take your project separate from your Illustrator file and put them in different places, or you're back to dealing with missing links when you try to open these files at home. Okay? We're going to get into collecting files and how to do that properly. That's actually one of the exercises we're going to go through in class, and you'll get graded based on learning how to do that. So it's like a twofer. You get a cool couple of points for learning a useful thing that you need to be able to do. Okay? All right, and this video will be up on Vimeo as soon as I load it, and I will see you guys in the next class. If you have any questions, you can hang out. I'll get them answered as soon as I can.
Good luck with today's lesson.